George Harrison never raised his voice, rarely lashed out, and carried a quiet bitterness that deepened over time. Behind his meditative calm and spiritual pursuits, there was a grudge that remained personal and unresolved. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney dominated the spotlight, George often felt invisible within the Beatles. His frustration wasn't loud or dramatic, it simmered beneath the surface. From the earliest days, he navigated a world where his ideas were overshadowed, his contributions undervalued. The Quiet Beatle nickname captured only part of the story. Beneath it was a man who quietly wrestled with being sidelined and underappreciated. Early beginnings in Liverpool. In the early 1960s, George Harrison was a teenager riding a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They bonded over skiffle, rock and roll, and shared records, with McCartney's confidence captivating the quieter, impressionable George. When Harrison first auditioned for John Lennon's group, the Quarrymen, he was only 15. Lennon initially thought he was too young, but after a second audition arranged by McCartney, George impressed John with a guitar line from Ranchy. That moment changed his trajectory, opening the door to the band that would become the Beatles. Even then, George was stepping into a story already dominated by others, walking into someone else's story. From the start, Harrison was walking into a dynamic dominated by Lennon and McCartney. They were the band's visionaries, primary songwriters, and public faces. George followed, absorbing their craft, learning, and quietly contributing. For a while, that was enough, but as the Beatles' fame skyrocketed, the quiet admiration he once felt began to shift. His musical ideas were often ignored, his guitar arrangements questioned, and his songs passed over. McCartney's perfectionism sometimes meant he controlled more than just the music. Harrison later admitted that years of being subtly undermined had left a mark, leaving him frustrated and feeling increasingly invisible within his own band. The White Album tensions. By 1968, Harrison had grown as a songwriter, developing confidence and ambition. But the Beatles' studio sessions were growing tense. McCartney's drive for perfection clashed with George's desire for creative space. Lennon, distracted by his relationship with Yoko Ono, was less engaged. The White Album sessions revealed Harrison's growing impatience with being overshadowed. The quiet frustration he had carried for years began to surface. George's contributions were finally significant, but the environment still stifled him. In the studio, he no longer wanted to play a supporting role. His simmering resentment was reaching a tipping point, threatening the fragile equilibrium of the band. Let It Be, the breaking point. The Let It Be sessions in early 1969 exposed the fractures within the Beatles. One moment between George and Paul perfectly captured the tension. McCartney attempted to direct Harrison's guitar on Two of Us, and George responded with calm but firm defiance. "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." It was subtle, quiet, and cutting. A resignation born of years of frustration. The engineer, Glenn Johns, described the atmosphere as unpleasant. George temporarily quit the band, signaling the culmination of years of artistic suffocation. His silence spoke louder than any argument ever could. Artistic resurgence in solo work. Returning to the Beatles under new terms, Harrison channeled his growing independence into songwriting. Tracks like Something and Here Comes the Sun showcased his talent when left to his own devices, but the emotional scars of working under McCartney's dominance were lasting. The split in 1970 wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Harrison's solo work, particularly All Things Must Pass, 1971, gave voice to years of unexpressed frustration. Songs such as Wah Wah contained metaphors for the emotional noise he endured. His bitterness toward McCartney was quiet but clear, marking a turning point where George reclaimed his creative identity away from the shadow of the Beatles. Legal battles and lingering frustration. The legal conflicts following the Beatles' breakup deepened Harrison's sense of estrangement. McCartney initiated the lawsuit to dissolve the band's business partnership, a necessary step but one that felt like betrayal to George. His 1973 track Sue Me, Sue You Blues reflected the tension, a pointed commentary on the situation. Beyond music, the personal dynamic with McCartney remained fraught. Harrison's ex-wife, Pattie Boyd, recalled George returning home from sessions filled with anger at Paul's perfectionism. Tolerance replaced affection. The creative partnership had shifted into a quiet battlefield, and Harrison's professional and personal relationships with McCartney became increasingly difficult to reconcile. Confession of a silenced guitarist. By the mid-1970s, Harrison had built a successful solo career, but the psychological impact of years with McCartney lingered. In a 1975 radio interview, he confessed, "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul. He ruined me as a guitar player." George clarified that McCartney's actions weren't malicious, but the effect of constant oversight and control had been damaging. Harrison spent years playing what others wanted, rather than developing his own voice. The statement revealed the depth of his quiet suffering. A man celebrated for his guitar work, but privately undermined by the dynamics within the Beatles. The Lennon connection. Harrison's relationship with Lennon was different, but equally complicated. Initially, George idolized John, seeing him as a mentor and partner in creativity. Lennon encouraged experimentation, but as the years passed, he became increasingly absorbed in personal matters, particularly his relationship with Yoko Ono. George found himself emotionally sidelined. Unlike McCartney, whose control was overt, Lennon's indifference was subtle but cutting. He mocked George's spiritual pursuits, leaving him feeling invisible and misunderstood. Even in grief, after Lennon's murder in 1980, Harrison's tribute was understated, reflective, and tinged with the memory of early closeness marred by later estrangement. Letting time pass. In the 1990s, Harrison largely stepped away from the Beatles' shadow. He had become a respected solo artist, philanthropist, and spiritual thinker. Despite this, the emotional residue of past relationships lingered. Public appearances were rare, and when speaking of the Beatles, Harrison was dry, ironic, and measured. He avoided romanticizing the past, instead offering reflections laced with subtle honesty. Old wounds persisted. Even reunions, such as the 1994 anthology project, brought back familiar tensions. While fans saw healing, insiders noticed Harrison bristling under McCartney's direction, his patience tested despite decades of maturity and perspective. A quiet reconciliation. As Harrison faced his final years, illness brought old friends close. McCartney visited, and the meeting was personal and understated. Paul later described holding George's hand, calling him "my baby brother." For the first time, the two shared a gesture of closeness rarely seen in earlier decades. Even then, the reconciliation was quiet, understated, and perhaps incomplete. Harrison's philosophical wit remained intact. He once quoted, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." His final years reflected acceptance, yet the complex emotional patterns of his life could not be fully erased. Legacy of quiet resilience. George Harrison died on November 29, 2001, surrounded by loved ones. His final words, "Love one another," reflected the man he had become. A musician, spiritual seeker, and quietly resilient individual. The complexity of his relationships with McCartney and Lennon remained, and some wounds never fully healed. Yet Harrison left behind a legacy of artistic brilliance, deep introspection, and subtle rebellion. His music spoke volumes even when his voice remained calm. Through decades of admiration, love, frustration, and occasional bitterness, George Harrison embodied the quiet underdog whose silence revealed the depth of his experience, creative genius, and personal growth. Reflection on forgiveness. George Harrison's life within and beyond the Beatles was shaped as much by silence as by sound. He endured being overshadowed, undervalued, and misunderstood, yet continued to create music that resonated across generations. His relationship with Paul McCartney illustrates the complexities of human bonds, admiration and resentment, love and friction intertwined. Even as public reconciliation occurred, the emotional depth of past grievances never entirely vanished. Harrison's story reminds us that forgiveness is often quiet, incomplete, and personal. His legacy endures in his songs, spiritual insights, and the subtle power of resilience against creative and personal suppression.